After waiting for 2 long months, today we say goodbye to one of our longest available options. Welcome to Mystara, as this week you have selected by a narrow margin the events of the Ethengar-Wendar War, a hypothetical conflict in the 1005 timeline where the hordes of Moglai Khan surprised the peaceful northern kingdom of Wendar, instead of getting bogged down in the stalemate that was the invasion of the Elven freeholds in the 1010 timeline. But enough lead up, I'm Mr. Welch, and it's time to let Mongols do what they do best. For those not familiar with the 1005 timeline, here's a brief overview. It was created to avoid the sweeping changes of Wrath of the Immortals and included two massive wars being waged on either end of the known world, with Thyatis and Alphatia fighting to a practical draw, and the Western Alliance nations defeating the armies of the Master of Hul. Alphatia and Alfheim still remain, though the Broken Lands were conquered by the Shadow Elves and filled with a magical force using multiple forms of magic. The Ethengar came out of the Great War as a new powerhouse. Moglai Khan survived an assassination attempt by the Master's agents and several of his less loyal Khans, and instead of joining the war immediately, just plotted his revenge. That came at the Battle of Faverow, the turning point of the war. The Master had committed the bulk of his force to crush the badly outnumbered Western Alliance forces. With the desert nomads fully engaged in battle, Ethengar's cavalry appeared suddenly and slammed into the flank of the nomad forces. This surprise attack broke the line of the desert nomads, and most of the survivors were ridden down by the vengeful Ethengarians. Moglai Khan overran the Master's baggage train in the rout and allowed his men to loot the wealth of the Hulian forces. Every Ethengar warrior returned laden with gold and gems. Flash forward a couple of years. Ethengar is now one of the more powerful nations in the known world, not only because they came out of the war intact, but actually better than before they entered it. Merchants from the rebuilding nations flood into Ethengar offering goods for some of the gold taken as plunder. Moglai Khan, instead of being the feckless and put-upon would-be conqueror, now entertains ambassadors from many of the more powerful nations. But he does want more. His people were born to conquer, to ride their steppe ponies across the lands of other nations, looting and taking as they pass. His men are growing restless. The treasure they took from the Master has mostly been squandered by the troops, and they're looking for Moglai to get them more. That's where it gets complicated, as Ethengar is boxed in on every side. They hate Glantri, but the only way in or out of Glantri is a well-defended bottleneck. Attempts to attack the nation that way has always met with defeat. To the west lies Rockholm, one of the staunchest allies of Ethengar, and besides, mountains are a natural defense against cavalry. New Angmar lies to the southwest, but it's still a poor nation, and the thick purple and blue trees that the nation is famous for make it impossible to navigate on horseback. To the immediate south, past another mountain range, is Darrakin, but it's still rebuilding from the war, plus it's heavily connected with other nations. That nation was ravaged by the Master just 2 years ago. Invading now means the Ethengarians would be fighting over the remaining scraps. There's the Elven freeholds to the north, but they're poor and also isolated. The force necessary to conquer them wouldn't be able to pillage enough to make it worth their while. Due east is Vestland, but to get to the actual cities of Vestland, they have to go through miles and miles of nothing, with a lot of trolls between them and their target. That leaves one available target, Wendar to the northwest. Wendar is an elven nation largely separated from the known world by a series of mountain ranges, which makes them identical to every other nation in the known world. There are known and broad passes connecting them to Glantri, Helden, and the dark nation of Denegoth to the north. Wendar is enemies with Denegoth, but allies with Glantri and neutral with Helden. This means their southern border is poorly defended, as they don't see the Helden as a threat. That's why Moglai Khan sets his plan in motion. Ethengar begins sending merchants and caravans to Wendar. The caravans are filled with spies to count Wendar garrisons as they pass. For the better part of the year, they trade with the Wendar and learn their customs and their ways. Wendar is small but prosperous. Their only threat is Denegoth, and that border is where the bulk of their relatively small army is located. And more importantly, the spies learn the best time to invade, during Wendar's parliament, when the leaders of all the towns converge to the capital to discuss business with the king. Wendar's strength is that as elves, many of them know at least some magic. Moglai takes in all the information. Wendar's only ally is Glantri. The nation is isolated, does little trade with other nations, and its population is thinly stretched out except for the army in the north. The Great Khan makes his decision. Ethengar is going to war. The southeastern pass is guarded by a couple hundred elves. It's not expecting trouble when the Ethengarians assault in force. They make their way through the Helden footholds unopposed by the freeholders, who are just relieved to see the army ignoring them on their way to Wendar. The alarm is sounded as the elves rush to defend the border. Normally they could hold out with advance warning, but Moglai Khan has brought over 30,000 Ethengar warriors, and they use raw speed to get through the pass before a proper defense can be raised. Moglai Khan rides his army quickly. They know surprise and speed are their strengths. They don't stop to pillage every village or town they come across. Religious shrines are especially off limits, and the penalty for looting them is death. On a few occasions, confused elven priests are offered apologies by an Ethengarian officer as he returns looted artifacts as well as the head of the soldier that stole them. Because of this, unauthorized looting is quite rare. The speed of the assault panics the Wendar forces. They begin marching most of their army from Sherwatch and Gilharan keeps, but they are largely an infantry force numbering in the thousands compared to the Ethengar force of tens of thousands comprised entirely of cavalry. Within 2 days, the town of Kevar is captured, faster than the Wendar king Gilharan anticipated. The Ethengarians are covering almost 50 miles a day on average, meaning they will be at the capital in 3 days with almost nothing between them and the king. On the advice of his advisors, Gilharan flees the capital, making for Glantri to get their aid in the war. Exactly as King Gilharan planned, the bulk of Mogulai Khan's forces arrive on the 3rd day. Standing between them and the capital are 4,000 elves, including the garrison from Gilharan Keep, who force-marched from their garrison. The initial battle is a slaughter. The elves march out and are faced by a wide line of Ethengarian horsemen. While the elven magic kills hundreds, they are still overwhelmed by the numbers and speed of the invaders. Half of the elven army is lost, while the rest retreat into the capital and prepare for a siege. To the horror of the elves, this is exactly what Mogulai Khan expected, and has his men begin building siege weapons on the spot, a lesson they learned from the dwarven engineers their Khan hired long ago to pass on their trade. After 2 days of constant barrages from the Ethengar siege weapons, the city surrenders, knowing it's just a matter of time. Captured in the fall of the capital of Wendar is a large number of their civic leaders. Mogulai Khan orders the civilians out of the city, then allows his men a full day to sack it before returning the population to their shattered homes. After the invasion has gone on for just over a week, other nations become aware of it. Glantri roundly condemns the invasion of their ally, with Prince von Drachenfels getting support from the Glantrian parliament to punish Ethengar for their warmongering. Darrican offers to broker a peace deal, though Mogulai's regent back in Ethengar, Chagatai Khan, placates the diplomatic corps with promises to consider their offer. The rest of the nations have little contact with Wendar, if any at all, and consider the war beyond their interests. The Elven army stationed at Shorewatch Keep realizes that a stand-up fight against Ethengar is suicide. The invaders have numbers and speed on their side. The only solution is a guerrilla war in hopes of lowering the morale. The problem is that the horsemen are very familiar with the tactics of hit and run and competent foes. While the elves are attacking patrols and sentries, Mogulai Khan is consolidating his hold on all of Wendar. His forces offer the remaining towns, surrender or death. Those that open their city walls, like the town of Duncansby, and allow the invaders to take what they want, are spared, no one is harmed. Those that resist, like the city of Silvar, are burned to the ground. After the example of Silvar, few towns resist the Ethengar army at all. Glantri enters the war a month after the invasion with a two-pronged assault. A punitive force attempts to invade from Glantri through the pass at Moldavia, with the expected results as a much smaller Ethengarian force is able to push the Glantrian troops back. Turns out the bottleneck between the two nations works at both ends. The main Glantrian force, led by von Drachenfels himself, enters through the Elven Pass to the southeast of Wendar. The mostly infantry force reaches several miles into Wendar before being ambushed by two forces of cavalry on either side. Drachenfels' magic is countered by the magic of multiple Hakamen brought by Mogulai Khan specifically for this eventuality. The Glantri force is largely obliterated, with only the rearguard able to retreat in good order. Von Drachenfels loses a large amount of power in Parliament after this debacle. Upon hearing of the conquest of Wendar, the Shadow Lord of Dinagoth decides to test the mettle of the Ethengar with a large force assaulting the mostly unguarded Shorewatch Keep. The army, consisting mostly of humanoids and human barbarians, breached several miles into Wendar before being met by the remnants of the Shorewatch garrison. Dinagoth forces push the undermanned elves back before Ethengar cavalry arrives and assault the Dinagoth forces. As it was just a probing attack, the humanoid commander orders a retreat to report back what he's seen. Now the Shadow Lord has a new, more powerful enemy on his southern border and has to plan for future conflicts. Elthanamar, the western and last of the Wendaran cities, falls 4 months after the invasion began. The relative small size of Wendar, along with the large amounts of open space, has allowed the Ethengarian army to overwhelm the few defenders. Mogulai Khan has also brought several times the number of soldiers Wendar has. The elven magic did little against a force that was too spread out to be affected by most spells. Wendar has to surrender. Mogulai Khan offers generous terms to King Gilharan. In exchange for a yearly tribute, the Wendar people would be allowed to live in peace. They would also assist the Ethengar in their next expedition, the conquest of Dinagoth. King Gilharan has no option but to accept. Glantri has informed him that Ethengar only brought half their army, as evidenced in the failed punitive expedition. The full Ethengar army was 10 times that of Wendar's army. To Gilharan's surprise, numerous elven commanders offer to accompany the Ethengar invasion of Dinagoth, as they've seen the effectiveness of the Ethengarians on open terrain. They believe that Moglai Khan can finally defeat their ancestral enemies, and that life under a would-be benevolent dictator is better than a life of constant fear from an evil warlord. The king isn't convinced of Moglai Khan's benevolence, but there's little he can do with tens of thousands of Ethengarians in his nation and Dinagoth preparing for war. The Ethengar-Wendar war is short and one-sided. Using the resources I could find, just using half of the Ethengar military, the Wendar were outnumbered easily 5-1 or more. What makes matters worse is they are expecting an invasion from the north, not a blitzkrieg from the south. Moglai Khan proves to be a highly competent military commander, knowing exactly how long it would take for his forces to overrun the country, and correctly predicting the Glantrian response. When most nations' borders are mountain passes, it's really difficult to actually invade each other, so you have to play to your strengths, and if you're going to base a fictional character off of Genghis Khan, he's going to have a lot of strengths. One of the biggest flaws, if not the biggest flaw, of the 10,010 timeline was all the conflict was gone. Ethengar was reduced to a shell of itself, being defeated at every turn, yet not overthrowing the Great Khan despite a long string of defeats. But in the 1005 version, Ethengar gets their time to shine. Well, it's time to go back to picking a new topic, as our month-long habit of voting in the new guy has been broken. Going back to some topics that were thrown back into the queue a while back, we have the Rot Dwarves, the Modrigswurg, the Twisted and Cursed Dwarves from the Northern Reaches that dish out insanity and artifact weapons in equal measure. So choose wisely. Until then, never mess with a man who force-feeds his enemies molten silver.